good. And I'd like to thank Andrey and Ibrat for inviting me and you all for attending. I look forward to a very interesting afternoon. Well, one thing I've been noticing on television, that whichever television program you watch, and this applies even to programs like Coronation Street, there's a tendency after the program to be concerned whether you've been worried about the content. Have you been troubled by the content of this episode of Coronation Street? And you're offered a helpline in case you have been troubled by the content. So anybody who's troubled by the content of this particular talk, Andrey and Ibrat will be available at the end to help them relax and recover from it. So thank you. Mike. It particularly applies to complexity theorists, I would think. So let me continue. Oops, the screen. Oh, there we go. Good stuff. Well, this is the structure of the presentation. So relatively simple. I'm going to talk about the nature of complexity, then systemic perspectives on complexity, and then systemic responses to complexity. Quite a lot of ground to cover, which is why I may not do justice to some of the detail. But perhaps we can pick that up in the questions later. I'm sure we can, and I can elaborate on my views on any of the detailed matters. But I think it fits very well with the Cranfield ambition here, which these seminar series are about complexity, they're about evolutionary perspectives, and they're about strategy. So we pick up complexity with the first bit. I'm actually going to talk about systemic perspectives in an evolutionary kind of way, showing how cognitive perspectives have evolved, or drawing upon that notion. And finally, systemic responses, that's about strategy. But you can also see it, if you like, as me talking a little bit about ontology in the nature of complexity, moving on to epistemology, and then on to methodology. So where do you begin? There are so many accounts of the nature of complexity. It probably does to start with a fairly broad philosophical account on the nature of complexity, and therefore I've chosen to start with Nicholas Rescher, a pragmatist philosopher who wrote a book in, I think it was 1998, on complexity, and I guess because of the burgeoning interest in the field, that was reprinted in 2019. Rescher divides complexity into ontological and cognitive versions. Ontological complexity is about the number of elements and their interactions and their variety. And it's about complexity in the world. And it is, he says, inexhaustible. Cognitive complexity is much more about how we interpret the world. But again, that is increasing with vast new ways of looking at the world and interpreting it. And of course, the two are interrelated. So for example, if our cognitive complexity increases, then we look at the world afresh and we see new aspects of ontological complexity. And as ontological complexity increases, our cognitive complexity tends to increase to try to keep up. So that's a good starting point, and it enables you to analyze other approaches to complexity. Perhaps the most common, popular version of complexity is to see it as having VUCA characteristics, came up in the US military in the 1980s, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. But the problem is these terms are very rarely well defined in the literature. And I was reading an article recently which was going to, I hope, was seeking to define them well, but it didn't actually manage to do so. Well, it defined them well, but it restricted complexity to ontological complexity. All of these characteristics, VUCA, were interpreted according to ontological complexity. So even ambiguity was a failure to understand cause-effect relationships. It didn't seem to have anything to do with different ways of interpreting the world. So you've got to be careful with the VUCA definition. I then want to look at ways of perceiving complexity from the natural science perspective and from the social science perspective. So here's some natural scientific perspectives on complexity. We perhaps need to remember where this began, a reasonable starting point, with chaos theory and the excitement of managers at that time. They knew that their rational models didn't work, but they didn't really understand why, and they were still grasping for order. And chaos theory, with its notion of order underlying complexity, seemed to potentially offer them a way of dealing with the disorder that they naturally found in their organizations. The problem being, of course, that strange attractors don't manifest themselves quite as readily in social systems, to manifest themselves at all. Then you get the work of the Santa Fe Institute, associated with the nomenclature complex adaptive systems and approaches such as agent-based modeling. From a natural scientific computational modeling perspective. Dave Snowden's Cuneiform perspective. Dave is very critical of people who derive complexity theory from the natural sciences when they ignore the differences between natural phenomena and people. He insists that people are not ants or termites on this various characteristics that they possess, which make them very different. But he still adheres to what he calls a naturalizing perspective, using concepts from the natural sciences to seek to understand complexity in the social domain. And I think there are issues with that, whether you can grasp concepts of intentionality and meaning, purposefulness and power using natural scientific perspectives. And then we get the word called, stemming from Prigogine, and the nice little book, Embracing Complexity by Peter Allen, Jean Bolton, and Cliff Beaumont, which is modest in its intent. It seeks to derive certain lessons which are common to physical, natural systems and social systems, but it doesn't push it. It doesn't claim that social systems are complex, adaptive systems. There are lessons to be learned. And I like that kind of approach. So metaphors we can bring across perhaps. Social science perspectives on complexity. I don't mean to say that these people are all social scientists. I'm aware that Ralph Stacey and Paul Cilliers were engineers, if I'm right, in their early careers. But these are people who take social science extremely seriously in looking at complexity. And there was a very nice seminar organized by the Institute for Physics a week or so ago, 10 days ago, which considered complexity in the social domain and brought together some of the main contributors to that approach. Ralph Stacey wasn't there, but he was represented by Chris Moles, who's taken over from him at Hertfordshire. Ricker Pricer, who knew Paul Cilliers and has developed his work, was there representing that perspective. Dave Byrne was there in person, and so was Peter Allen. Now, what strikes me when you look at this is when you interpret complexity theory, or when people have related complexity theory to the social domain, just how promiscuous complexity theory is. It's prepared to get into bed with any social theory that's passing it by. So in the early days, Ralph Stacey's work was functionalist. It was all about driving organizations to the edge of chaos so that they could learn more. Later, he was influenced by the work of Elias and Mead, and it became much more of an interactionist approach. Paul Cilliers, influenced by postmodernism. David Byrne and Callahan, critical realism underpins their version of complexity theory for the social sciences, and the sociology of radical change in Wolbe's perspective. So you are left asking yourself, is there really a coherent theory of complexity underpinning all this? If it can attach itself to such radically different social science paradigms, if it can embrace as many social theories as exist, then what is complexity theory doing? I'm not saying that some of these approaches don't enlighten us. I think they do, and some of them are very sophisticated readings of the relationship between these social theories and complexity theory. But nevertheless, it's one hell of a spread. And if complexity theory can attach itself to each of these, all of these social theories, then you are left asking questions about its coherence. I think, therefore, with so many views on complexity, so many perspectives, you're driven on to a sort of epistemological questions. How people see complexity, how people want to learn about it, and how people want to react in the face of complexity on the basis of that learning. Robert Cheer, in the last of previous one of these seminars, talked about the way different frameworks influence the way we look at complexity and therefore influence the way we act when we believe that complexity exists. And he pointed to the work of Edgar Morin as a good starting point here. And I want to particularly draw upon his distinction between restricted complexity and general complexity. So let's start with restricted complexity. This is an attempt to understand complexity, but remaining, as Morin puts it, within the epistemology of classical science. So it tends to embrace computational modeling techniques as a means of providing explanations for the behavior of complex systems. And let me provide you with some examples. I associated the Santa Fe approach with agent-based modeling, but there's also the work of Geoffrey West on scaling, and a recent book on scaling theory. And he says this in the book, one quotation, he says, we may look different, dress differently, speak different languages, and have different belief systems, but to a large extent, our biological and social organization and dynamics are remarkably similar. I have real difficulty with that. What can someone have been thinking to say that? Of course, if you take away everything that is human and social, then it may well be that our social organization and dynamics are similar, but it's wholly reductionist in its orientation. Another example from a recent book by, well, it's by John Kay and Mervyn King, and it's called Radical Uncertainty. And they treat classical economics as a form of restricted complexity. They don't actually use these terms, but that's how they treat it. As a form of modeling, which can be helpful in some circumstances, but can't get to grips with the complexity that exists in economies and in societies. And it is remarkable, isn't it, that the easiest way to win a Nobel Prize in economics, or their equivalent of a Nobel Prize, is to demonstrate that one of the key fundamental premises of economics is totally wrong. So Simon, for example, challenging optimization with satisficing, Kahneman, rationality with the fact that we don't always act rationally, Ostrom, competition with the fact that we sometimes collaborate. The easiest way to win a Nobel Prize in economics is to show that economics in its classical form is pretty much rubbish. Then you have Another example, health systems research, a huge community. They have conferences of about 2,000 people. They talk about how to improve health systems. They do health systems research, but they don't engage at all with systems thinking or systems research, and not a great deal with the more sophisticated versions of complexity theory either. So they pay lip service to complexity theory and often say they're dealing with complex adaptive systems, but in practice, their favored tool is the computational modeling provided by system dynamics. And that, of course, is a great restriction in terms of how they see the world, because they have to look at it in terms of feedback, feed-forward loops and lags, identify the variables, and so on in terms of system dynamics, but excluding lots of other wholly legitimate ways of perceiving the nature of health systems. So general complexity is what we, I think, in the complexity theory and in the systems traditions need to be aiming at. Moran says that general complexity resists universal truths. So complexity is unknowable. We can only have partial understandings of it. So the problem, he says, is epistemological, cognitive, and paradigmatic. It's the way we look at complexity, the way we interpret it, that we need to pay attention to, rather than trying to grasp its unknowability by reducing it to some sort of restricted complexity approach. And if you do this, you're driven on, in epistemological terms, to a second order understanding of different ways of looking at complexity. The notion of second order cybernetics came from von Fürster. It's taken on in the social sciences by Luhmann, who states that second order observation is observation of an observer with a view, my screen's slightly obscured, with a view to that which he cannot see. We become interested in the distinctions with which the observed observer works, and in how he divides up the world, and in what he considers important or not in which situations. So second order complexity would be looking at different approaches to complexity, what people see as important, how they divide up the world, or what aspects they give attention to. So, systemic perspectives on complexity. How does systems thinking view complexity? If complexity is unknowable, the general complexity notion, then it seems to me we're almost in the position in our different camps of being like different religions, trying to understand God or the absolute. There's something out there that we can't get a grasp on, and we seek to come to some understanding of it through metaphor and by partial understandings, if you like, and they differ from one religion to another. How can we grasp this unknowable absolute? And religion struggles, I'm afraid, because God, at least as far as I can tell, tends not to favor any one particular religion over another. He doesn't dole out all the miracles, or she doesn't dole out all the miracles to Christianity and leave Islam without any miracles. So God isn't much of a good guide about what religion is useful, most truthful. But we're not quite in that position in terms of the approaches that we take to complexity, I would argue. Because the physical world, the natural world, and the social world have over time indicated to us certain ways of dealing, certain ways of approaching them, which have yielded benefits to us as a species, as a human species. And this is the evolutionary bit of the talk. If I had to refer to some background thinking here, I'd go to the work of perhaps Pepper, who has indicated the existence, having trawled through metaphysics, of 4 what he calls world hypotheses. These are, Pepper says, successes of cognition, creative discoveries of generations, ways of thinking, world hypotheses, which have served us well. He has mechanism, formism, contextualism, and organicism. And these have served the human species well. The natural, physical, social worlds have indicated to us that we're onto something when we look at the world and act in the world according to these world hypotheses. Lakoff and Johnson talk about the metaphors we live by. And they say that certain metaphors have become almost experiential gestalts, useful, holistic ways of thinking, which again serve the human species well. So I've been trying to put these things together, Pepper's world hypotheses, Lakoff and Johnson's experiential gestalts, along with the metaphors that have served social theory and organization theory well, as encapsulated, for example, in Morgan's book, Images of Organization, and then work on sociological paradigms. And I've come up with these 5 different ways of viewing complexity, which I would argue are creative discoveries of generation, successes of cognition, experiential gestalts, useful ways of approaching it, even though in its totality it's unknowable. And those are the mechanistic, organismic, purposeful, societal, environmental, and interrelationships. If I were to go back again to Robert Cheer's talk, he was saying that traditional management and organization theory very much dominated by the metaphysics of substance, of Parmenides type thinking. You could say that the mechanistic approach is dominant, therefore, organismic. He was advocating a much more processual view, the metaphysics of process related to the work of Heraclitus, and arguing that that was a more useful way of proceeding, seeing order as emerging from chaos through processes. I don't want to make any kind of ontological commitments of that kind. I regard all these different ways of viewing complexity as potentially useful epistemological learning devices. So as Pepper puts it, the gears grind, the lights flicker, and the lenses distort. Nevertheless, we do seem to get some idea of our world from these vehicles, and without them, we should have to walk pretty much in the dark. We have to put our faith in some orientating worldviews, and these are ones which seem to have benefited humankind over time. So the final section of the talk is methodological, how we might respond to complexity, my take on strategy, or what I think Robert Cheer called wayfinding or something of that nature, wayfinding for strategy. And it's a systemic response, and no apologies for that. And the starting point is the work of people like Bogdanov, von Bertalanffy, and Wiener, the founding fathers of the systems approach. But it's extremely interesting that in the seminar that I pointed to 10 days or so ago at the Institute for Physics, when Jean Bolton was explaining the background of complexity theory, all these 3 people, Bogdanov, von Bertalanffy, and Wiener, had a place on her slides. And it indicates to me a point made well by Chris Moles from Hertfordshire later on in that seminar, that we do far better if we work together those of us in the systems tradition and those of us in the complexity tradition, more than perhaps we have done. There's almost been a standoff to some extent between systems thinking and complexity theory, and both sides have been to some extent to blame. However, complexity theorists are the most to blame because in some cases they've been claiming to go beyond systems thinking or represented their work as an advance on systems thinking. And I think if that claim is to be made, it needs to be done much more carefully. And there are certainly things that systems thinking is better at that complexity theory isn't, not least the various methodologies that systems thinking has developed to try and deal with complexity. Anyway, this is the basic change that in response to complexity that systems thinking is trying to bring about, a change from what Lakoff and Johnson call the puzzle metaphor, in which problems are puzzles for which typically there's a correct solution, and once solved they go away, to the chemical metaphor, accepting that no problem ever disappears forever. Rather than direct your energies towards solving your problems once and for all, you would direct your energies towards finding out what catalyst will dissolve your most pressing problems for the longest time without precipitating worse ones. And when they reappear, when a problem reappears, it's viewed as a natural occurrence, rather a failure on your part to find the right way to solve it. And in systems thinking, we've been dealing with complexity and trying to adopt this chemical metaphor for some time. Lakoff talked about messes, and of course, the notion of wicked problems is common across systems and complexity theory. And Rittel and Weber, when they coined the notion of wicked problems, talked in terms of them being constituted by the ambiguity of causal webs and also the pluralism of contemporary publics. And that, of course, goes back to Rescher with his ontological complexity and his cognitive complexity. So here are some of the systemic responses to complexity. And it's reasonable, I think, to see the history of the development of systems thinking as an awakening to different forms of complexity, an attempt to address different ways of looking at complexity. So systems thinking began in an applied form, as I think we'll mostly know, after the Second World War, with approaches such as systems engineering, systems analysis, and operational research, and with a concern for efficiency and efficacy, achieving agreed upon goals with the minimum use of resources. And that kind of approach is still useful in many circumstances. Originally, it helped get a man on the moon. Systems engineering, systems analysis were behind the Apollo program. And interestingly, a new book on economics by Mariana Mazzucato still goes back to systems engineering and the Apollo program as a guide to how we can undertake missions in society to, for example, get rid of inequality or deal with climate change. But the problem with that approach is that it didn't work when it was transferred to broader social problems in the urban sphere in the United States, to the Vietnam War, to other areas of greater complexity. And in fact, it ruined the reputation of systems thinking for a couple of decades. But fortunately for systems thinking, it developed ways of addressing what Dave Snowden would call complicated domains with system dynamics, looking at cause-effect relationships separated in space and time and feed-forward and feedback loops. It developed to deal with complex domains where you could not predict in advance what changes would take place, either in the system you're interested in or its environment. So organismic approaches came to the fore based upon socio-technical and viable systems approaches to managing adaptability, resilience, anti-fragility. And it also developed methodologies of a soft systems nature to deal with greater pluralism, where the problem is deciding what it was we should be doing bringing different stakeholders together to achieve mutual understanding, accommodations between different perspectives, and dealing with aspects of conflict. And also there are systems approaches which treat of broader societal and environmental issues, emancipatory systems approaches, such as critical systems heuristics, which seek to address issues of marginalization, disadvantage, inequality, and ask, in doing systems thinking, in developing systems designs, are we taking account of environmental issues and of future generations? Now, it's extremely useful, I'd point out here, that we have systems approaches which are capable of responding to all the various experiential gestalts or ways of looking at complexity. So we can move from ways of looking at complexity which bring us insight into systems methodologies which enable us to do something about those aspects of complexity. And the approach that I advocate, this is the final slide, the approach that I advocate to this is critical systems thinking. I've drawn quite a lot on pragmatist thinkers, Rescher, Lakoff and Johnson. Pepper was originally, but he renounced it later on. It's a pragmatic approach to general complexity by which we learn by engagement with the world. We don't in advance try to define the complexity we're facing. We learn about its multifaceted, multidimensional nature by engaging with it. So that we encompass as much of it as we can, we don't go down the road of totalizing. We adopt distinctive multi-perspectival approaches, keeping the different experiential gestalts separate and viewing the world through each of them. As Pepper says, we need all world hypotheses, so far as they are adequate. In other words, they've shown themselves to be useful over time for the human species, for mutual comparison and correction of interpretive bias. So that each one, in Luhmann's terms, can show you things that others are not showing you, and each can be used to critique the particular biases expressed by the one that you're working with at the moment. This leads you on to a multi-methodological approach. If you've gained a second order appreciation of what the different methodologies, systems methodologies are good at, whether it's dealing with pluralism or disadvantage, whether it's dealing with rapid change in the environment or efficiency and effectiveness, then you can understand what aspects of the world they might be capable of generating improvement in. You have to use them in combination to try and get to gain overall improvement, and that again is an issue addressed by critical systems thinking. And you have to be flexible. Quoting from John Kay and Mervyn King's book, the mark of the first-rate decision maker confronted by radical uncertainty is to organize action around a reference narrative, which might be one of the experiential gestalts and the various methodologies that resonate and give guidance according to that gestalt, while being open both to the possibility that this narrative is false, a better word is perhaps it's not giving you much insight, and that alternative narratives might be relevant. If you're switching your experiential gestalts and you're switching your methodologies as you engage with the world and learn from that engagement. And you're seeking general improvement. So if you were to use this approach to try and build better following the COVID pandemic, you'd be hoping to see improvement in terms of all the different world hypotheses or experiential gestalts. You want the health service to be more efficient, efficacious in achieving its goals. You'd want it to be capable of adapting to things that couldn't have been predicted in advance. You'd want variety to be spread throughout the system so it was more responsive, more anti-fragile. You'd want greater mutual understanding among those concerned with the health system, all the different stakeholders involved, those affected as well as those involved in decision making, and you'd seek to bring about improvement in all those various indices, some kind of general improvement measured by the set of the experiential gestalts. And you'd find that hard to do, but you would be able to critique particular forms of improvement from the perspective of other forms of improvement, and over time to seek to gain some kind of improvement from all the variety of different perspectives. So I'll call a halt there. There's a short book, 700 pages on this kind of thinking, subtitled Responsible Leadership for a Complex World, and it's a review of the development of modern systems thinking, 10 of the foremost systems methodologies, the way they address complexity, and how they can be used in combination. And as I say, if anybody needs the helpline, I hope they don't, then Ibrat and Andrey are available for you. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mike. I might have to deflect it back to you then.
Okay.
So I do have a couple of questions, and if you don't mind, I'm going to kick off and then maybe hand it over to Ibrat. And I think what I'll also do is just for to make it easier for everyone to see us.
Okay.
I'll just add us here, and I've lost Ibrat for a second. There we go.
Hello, Ibrat.
Hi, Mike.
Mike, one question I was going to ask you, unsurprisingly probably, about the systems perspective. And as you said, your answer to complexity, or your strategic answer to complexity, is, I think the phrase you used is unashamedly systemic. And I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about what is it that kind of systems-driven approaches to complexity give us that that other forms of understanding complexity can't. So, for example, the pure process perspective, or the wayfinding, or what have you. Why systems?
Well, perhaps the answer, Andrey, is that systems have been in the game a bit longer. I pointed some of the common roots between systems thinking and complexity theory, and people like Pigogine acknowledged a debt to Bertalanffy, self-organization. Perhaps the idea came from Ashby originally, and people like Stuart Kaufman acknowledged a debt to that. And system thinking has a lot to learn from complexity theory, and the way that the various forms of complexity have given us much greater appreciation of that whole perspective, if you like. But where system thinking, I think, is stronger is in the development of methodologies that can aid decision makers to put some of these ideas into practice. So, as I was indicating towards the end, system thinking began with this in the 1940s and 1950s with systems engineering, systems analysis. When those approaches failed in extremely complex situations, it developed system dynamics, it developed organizational cybernetics survival system model, then soft systems approaches to seek to come to terms with pluralism, critical heuristics, seek to come to terms with disempowerment, disadvantage. So there's a whole range of different systems methodologies which seem to me to address different aspects of complexity, and it's in this methodological area where I think systems thinking is still ahead. Where there are approaches to understanding and acting on the basis of complexity from a complexity theory perspective, you have agent-based modeling, but to me it's reductionistic in orientation. Dave Snowden's just written an interesting piece for the European Union, produced by the European Union and the Cunningham Centre, which moves much more towards the methodology for using complexity theory ideas. So I think there's room for collaboration across the piece here, but I do think that systems thinking is ahead in terms of giving practical guidance to decision makers about how you put these ideas into effect. With regard to Robert Chia, Robert was making the case very much from a process perspective, and I don't disagree with that. And I think it's justified on the basis that traditional management and organization theory has very much been dominated by the Parmenides, the substance metaphysics, as he would put it. And so there's a case for emphasizing the process perspective as an alternative to that. I just don't want to make that ontological commitment. I like my islands of stability created by negative entropy. And I'm interested in how to maintain their stability and make them better, as much as I'm interested in dealing with issues of process, if you like. And I don't actually see a lot of difference between that and the wayfinding approach or the way you describe it at Cranfield either.
Sure. And in a way, I suppose that's where most of the critique or criticism of systems thinking would originate, is with this idea that these islands of stability, these systems, right? These are essentially arbitrary decisions as to how we define and delineate systems. So wouldn't that be kind of an encumbrance rather than a help?
I think you're right. That is the basic criticism of systems thinking. Well, Stacey is in particular. We heard in the seminar from the Institute of Physics that whether it's apocryphal or not, that at one time he banned the use of the word systems in the seminars he was involved in. No, I mean, I think that reading of systems thinking is out of date. Well, it's been out of date a long time. With Walter Buckley, for example, you get, in the theoretical domain, you get equal emphasis on morphogenesis as you do on morphostasis on a process perspective. You do if you take the work of Boulding and Vickers seriously, and that's what translated into Cheklin's process methodology and the dialectical approach which was developed by Churchman and developed methodologically by Mason and Mitroff and others. And these are processual approaches. So I think systems thinking actually it has developed to the extent that it's capable of thinking in processual terms where that's useful. And also looking, as I say, to these islands of stability that emerge from time to time and trying to ensure that those are islands of stability which are actually beneficial to humankind rather than detrimental to them. It's out of date to say that systems thinking is only concerned with morphostasis and stability and maintaining systems in place and equilibrium. Ever since Bogdanov, it's been about processes has had a big part to play.
Which means from the very origin.
From the very origin, I think, yeah.
Right. Thank you. Ibrat, do you have any questions?
Yeah, thank you, Andrey. Thank you, Mike. My question relates to, because we have a large audience here, and among the participants are researchers as well. My question pertains to, how do we operationalize these ideas of critical system thinking in research? And maybe particularly you alluded a number of times to health systems research. Maybe there's some kind of application or suggestions you could make there. Yeah,
thanks, Ibrat. Let me deal with the question in terms of health systems research, since you raised that one. That's became a particular interest to me because one of my PhD students, Louis Samba, was Director General of the World Health Organization in Africa at the time of the Ebola outbreak. And that was mishandled in the same way as I think it's arguable COVID was mishandled in this country. And we recently written a paper on why we think that was mishandled. But in a sense, to come to your question, health systems research, how could that help health systems researchers and practitioners to do things better? And so we looked at I got a paper on this published. You look at the literature of health systems research, and as I say, they nod to the notion of complex adaptive systems, but they then don't seem to feel the need to interrogate them much as to what they might be like. They just assume that having mentioned the word, it's some sort of magic. And when it comes down to it, their favored technique is overwhelmingly system dynamics, which can be fruitful and helpful in many cases. You want to be looking at the interactions between the various elements of the health system, obviously. But it prevents you from looking at other ways of looking at the health system. You can see it as a system that needs to be flexible and adaptive. It needs to be able to recover and respond quickly to black swan events like maybe Ebola wasn't, but to that kind of unpredictable event. And there are systems approaches such as the viable system model that would show you how to decentralize, to spread decision-making throughout the system in a way that would enable it much better to respond to things that it couldn't predict in advance. You recognize that you can see health systems as made up of a whole variety of different stakeholders, all of whom have a legitimate right to their say about what that health system should be doing, who it should be serving, and how it should be functioning. And so bringing the stakeholders together to achieve a greater degree of mutual understanding is inevitably going to be helpful when a crisis emerges. They don't all go off in different directions in terms of what it is they're prioritizing or seeking to achieve. Similarly, you can see health systems as benefiting certain sections of the population at the expense of others. And it was quite late in the day with COVID that this came to the fore as a very significant, highly significant issue. But looking back at it, it deserved to be right there up front. It's clear that those who were working in certain profession or certain areas, particularly BAME communities, were going to be subject to more infection. The highest infection rate in the country at the moment is not many miles from where I'm sitting in Hull. And that's because people in Hull can't work from home. People are still actually employed in factories. And they have to go out to work. They cannot afford to stay at home. They wouldn't be able to support their families. So the argument is that if health systems research were to embrace a broader range of perspectives on the nature of the health system and tackle the issue with a broader range of systems approaches, cybernetics, system dynamics, soft systems, critical systems heuristics, worked with them in combination, then you'd have a much greater chance of succeeding in bringing about improvement over time in terms of what the health system were doing. And health systems researchers themselves, in their own literature, go on and on and on about how they don't take advantage of the wide range of systems approaches that are available, but they still fail to engage properly with those communities who, if you like, have seen it as their raison d'etre to explore different systems approaches to complexity.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you. Mike, I do have a couple of other questions, but I also want to give everyone in the audience a chance to interact with you as well. So I think we're going to open it for questions. So two ways to do it. If you guys have a question, you can post it in the chat room, or alternatively, at the bottom of the screen, if you press on reactions, you'll be given an option to raise your hand. And in that case, we'll spot it and we'll give you the airtime.
Can I perhaps start with some questions in the chat?
Please.
Sander Mulder is saying, my question would be, what do you lose if you do not embrace an ontological commitment? Or vice versa, what do you gain when embracing a particular ontological commitment?
What do you gain by embracing a particular ontological commitment? I think you potentially restrict yourself when you adopt a particular ontological commitment. I'll go off the health sector. Let's go into something like project management, because I know there's some project management people here. Project management is an approach that's much influenced by systems engineering. It's probably still the system methodology that's most used in project management. And as project management people continually say, will admit themselves, major projects fail a lot of the time, and the figures are appalling in terms of failure rates, depending upon what you read. 70, 80, 90% major projects don't come in on time or on cost or do what they're supposed to do, etc. They look to, and it's arguable because projects are still seen very much from a narrow engineering perspective. And they embrace the notion that systems exist in the world. They're committed to the idea that there are systems out there which you can understand, which you can learn about, which you can provide explanations for how they work, that you can predict the behavior of. So they're adopting a particular ontological perspective there, which is narrow in a sense. And of course, when people come to question why it is that projects fail, they'll come up with things that, for example, projects are also about maintaining communication among different forms of stakeholders. So all the time throughout the project, particularly if it's a long project, if you're developing a military aircraft, for example, you're constantly negotiating what it is you actually want. People's wishes, people's requirements change over the decades that it takes to bring a project of that nature to fruition. So you're constantly throughout the project having to negotiate some kinds of accommodations between stakeholders so that you can keep the thing on some kind of even keel, even if it's moving off the intention that was originally. And that requires you, it seems to me, it'd be useful there, pragmatically useful, to adopt a different kind of ontological commitment, which would be the interpretive one, that actually the world's made from the way that people interpret it. And if you want to achieve the degree of stability necessary to bring a project to fruition, then you have to work with people's interpretations of the world, people's worldviews and their perspectives, and maintain some agreement, some mutual understanding between them, at least accommodation between them. And I could go on and offer you alternative ontological perspectives, that projects will potentially disadvantage some groups. If you do that, then some people are going to suffer, and that's going to come back and hit you in the future. You can see projects as, in an organismic sense, as evolving over time, and as they adapt to changes in their environment and internal problems, they adapt over time. And so it's useful to adopt that particular, I would call it systemic perspective, which enables you to see it differently, alerts you to different kinds of issues, and provides you with guidance as to what kind of systems approaches would enable you to act upon that kind of thinking. So maintaining ontological agnosticism is being willing to entertain a variety of ontological stances and not being blinded just by one, because I don't have the answer between Heraclitus and Parmenides.
Very good.
Thank you, Mike. Hannah is asking, what do you recommend for practitioners wanting to choose an approach over another? and not wanting to be bogged down in critically analyzing all the different theories?
Speak about pragmatism, huh?
Yeah, I don't think it is. I've noticed that there is a tendency to think that system thinking is difficult because there are a whole variety of different systems approaches, and there are people bringing systems approaches to the fore all the time, not always all that well thought out. But I actually don't think it's that hard to think in terms of, and this is why I've done this work, in terms of 5 systemic perspectives. That it's useful to look at the world through a mechanistic lens, an organismic lens, as a cultural, political, or purposeful systems, contextualist lens, if you like, a societal, environmental lens, and an interrelationships lens. That simplifies it, really. And those are differences that make a difference. If you look at the world through any of those, you'll see very different things, often contradictory things. They'll each present you with different aspects of the world that you're looking at. And from that, you're asking the question, well, if this particular perspective on complexity seems to yield a lot of insight, gains traction with decision makers, allows them to think, I want to move forward with this and do something about what this shows me is wrong, perhaps, or how I can improve it, perhaps, then that leads you to a type of systems methodology which is appropriate to those sorts of issues. And of course, it is impossible to work with them all simultaneously. What critical systems thinking has tried to do is to find ways and means of acting pragmatically, if you like, Andrey, acting pragmatically, whereby having gained some insight into what might be a useful way of addressing the problem situation or the thing you want to improve through using the different experiential gestalts, then if you like, you take a chance and you move forward with one way of addressing the issues. All the time, though, being aware that, as Kay and King put it, there are alternative narratives. Let's say you're moving forward on the mechanistic track. There are alternative societal narratives, organismic narratives, purposeful system narratives, which you might want to bring into play at any point. And you're constantly going to be critiquing what you're doing if you're pursuing a mechanistic route from the perspectives of those alternative narratives. Now, I don't think that is too difficult. It gives you space to move ahead with just one form of systems thinking, one form of systems approach, if you like. It just asks you to keep the others in the background, critiquing what you're doing and potentially ready to move them from the position of being in the background to being the dominant perspective through which you're viewing the world and acting upon it.
Thank you, Mike. Rachel is writing, thank you very much. Forgive my academic ignorance here, but it seems you're drawing heavily from quote unquote Western or Northern theories and thinkers. Are there limitations that come with such theoretical ancestry? How do you perceive, or what contributions are you seeing from experiences and learning from the global South?
I think it's a completely legitimate question. And the answer is that I haven't done much. You could argue that critical system thinking is a highly rationalistic approach, as all the other approaches which embraces, it tries to give space to, if you like, and show the relevance and importance of. But there has been work going on at Hull into how Eastern, Indian, Southern approaches might take you beyond the rational mind. How, I don't know whether, and of course the literary, if you like, rational mind, and some people prefer techniques of picturing or more dramatic, dramaturgical techniques to bring in other aspects of the mind to bear and to, if you like, address multi-perspectival issues on a different plane to just the rational plane.
But presumably, if I could interject, Mike, presumably that would still fit under the kind of agnostic critical approach to this, perhaps broadly construed.
Look, I'm from Yorkshire, and I'm a very straightforward person, so I struggle with non-rational. My whole upbringing is of a particular down-to-earth type, and I shy away from personally shy away from group exercises, T group training, and all the rest of it. So I'm not the person to ask. But as you say, I'm not disinclined in any way to entertain the idea that there may be other forms of in the mind which we need to bring out to address complexity in ways that we've not been able to do with just rational thinking.
Maybe one more question, if you allow me, Ibrat, kind of some straddling into your realm here. But one of the questions, one of the very applied, I suppose, questions that I can see in the chat room is, it's coming from Adrian Brown. And the question is, what's the best example that you have seen of systems thinking being applied in practice? Any form of systems thinking. What are some of the success stories?
I mean, I could give you examples of all the various systems approaches and the successes that they've had. And I think in the book I gave, I'm not trying to shy away from the question, but the book I gave, the book at the end, the 10 methodologies are all illustrated by success stories, if you like, so that just that people can help to grasp success stories using systems approaches. And the 3 examples there of use of critical systems thinking were combined approaches. Let me give you an example that comes to mind, because again, I just finished a paper on it. It is an example that appears in the book, which was the regeneration of the Segura River in Spain. And it's very important to me because my wife and I just bought a house next to the Segura River some 10 years ago, and read then that it was the most polluted river in the whole of Spain, but we'd already bought the house. But when we got back home, I researched it more thoroughly. The river had actually been cleaned up in a major systems engineering project led by a guy called Miguel Angel Rodenas. And they turned the river from the most polluted in Spain to the least polluted. There's no pollution now throughout its length, negligible pollution throughout its length. Much more water is put back into the river so that its flow is maintained from its source to the sea. Much more is drawn out, clean water for agriculture. And the river has become a playground for water sports, fishing, canoeing, rafting, and a number of bird reservoirs on the river are recognized through the Ramsar Convention, whatever it's called, the famous, where they maintain rare species of birds. Just a fantastic achievement. And it was a systems engineering project. So what Miguel Rodenas and I did were aware of the problems that systems engineering can sometimes encounter, look at the circumstances which led to that systems engineering being an appropriate systems methodology in that case, and bringing out and being successful. And I recently turned this into a discussion of where systems engineering, in my view, needs to go if it's going to have greater success in extending its range from, it was successful in the space program, it was successful in aerospace, over lots of technical issues, but it's long wanted to extend its range to socio-technical problems, and you'll see that ambition in COSI documents. And I tried to look at why it worked in the Segura case, and the reason was that the simple transformation of turning the river from the most polluted to the least polluted was the transformation that was needed by all of the systems within the system of systems. So that one transformation led to economic gains in terms of agriculture and the water that was available there. It led to social gains. Prior to the river being cleaned up, people were protesting in Murcia and the villages along its length about the stink and the stench. It led to gains in tourism. It's now a big centre, say, for boating and rafting. It led to environmental gains. Just the one transformation was actually relevant to all these different systems within the system of systems. Now, you don't often find that. You often find that if you make a technical transformation, you're going to get into all sorts of problems with the social system or the economic system or the environmental system. So the suggestion, obviously, was that if systems engineering wants to progress as a discipline and become more relevant to socio-technical problems, then it really needs to embrace other forms of systems thinking which were designed to address those other aspects of complexity which very frequently get in the way of straightforward technical transformations of that type.
Thank you. And we've got a question from the audience, and it's coming from one of our Cranfield colleagues, Sergey.
Thank you very much, Andrey. Michael,
Sergey.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can, Sergey, thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. Your presentation is so deep that, you know, it feels like the rest I've read about strategy is pulp fiction. So thank you very much for this. My question is, what is your perspective on the attempts to oversimplify our responses to complexity? So to put that in perspective, one of the examples is the book by Kathleen Eisenhardt and Donald Sewell, and it called Simple Rules. All right, so what do you think if one of our students comes to our lecture theater and says, you know what, it is less complex that you are presenting here. So simple rules work, red, orange, green, and that's it. So what do you think?
Well, that's what students want to hear, isn't it? And to some extent,
yeah,
managers and decision makers want to hear that. And,
yeah, we call it Heathrow School of Management.
Yeah, yeah, and I did my year's system thinking course at Lancaster under Peter Checkland, and they were very clear that the kind of student they were looking for were those who'd gone into work in the public sector or the private sector, perhaps trained as management thinkers, perhaps with MBAs, and suddenly found that things did not work as they expected them to work. There were no simple solutions to complex problems. And they wanted people who were on the cusp of that, you know, oh God, it doesn't work. Everything I've been taught doesn't work. I need to rethink things. And those were the kind of students that they were looking for. And I was exactly in that position. I've been in the civil service, in the Inland Revenue, actually. And all the cases, in theory, all the answers were in case law, in the statute books or in case law. But it wasn't actually like that. And so you're looking around for other ways of dealing with complexity. So basically, these people have to wait until they get out in the world, and they'll soon find out for themselves. And if they don't find out for themselves, I'm afraid they won't be very successful. There'll be people who go about repeating the same thing over and over again and never learning from the mistakes. So I mean, I'm getting onto the grounds that we all know well as systems complexity theorists and all agree with. You learn far more from trying to do the right things wrong and from your mistakes than you do over and over, repeating an attempt to you know. So if you want to be successful in the world, then you've got to embrace greater levels of complexity, I think.
Thank you very much, Mike.
There's, I mean, if I just, another thing I think about there, I mean, as I say, when chaos theory came to the fore, I think managers really did think, you know, oh, here we've got a real chance of understanding. We know our organizations are a mess. They don't work as we're told. There's all this informal stuff going on. People talking behind your back as a manager, people having their own groups, people taking it off in this direction, that direction. You know. Managers really did think that maybe there's something in this because there are strange attractors. Maybe we can understand the order underlying the chaos. But you know, it's too simple. As I say, the notion of a strange attractor, okay, as a very, very vague metaphor, you might be able to translate it to the social domain. But you know, in terms of people sharing the same story, if people share the same narrative, they share the same story, then they may be tempted to act in a coherent kind of way. But I'm not sure whether that term taken from, you know, physics, physical sciences, and translated over to the social domain is actually much use. It's misleading in lots of ways. It's as though some sort of force exists behind people, which draws them to act in a particular, according to a strange attractor, rather than it actually being a matter of meaning and intention and purposefulness and the sharing of worldviews, which make sure that they're all on the same page, if you like.
Thank you very much, Michael.
Mike, another question in the chat is from Natalia. Could you please advise on what is the difference between soft system thinking and a stakeholder theory?
Well, I mean, stakeholder theory. Stakeholder theory has lots of meanings. Very simple terms. You look at everybody who's has some sort of role or purpose, involvement with an organization. If you're taking an organization, they have some form of involvement with it. It's often used these days, and there's been interesting debates that have been involved in here as a under the current society as different to shareholder theory, that the benefits of organization should go to the shareholders. Stakeholder theory says, well, no, in a decent form of capitalism, and indeed in a form of capitalism which will ultimately will benefit shareholders as well, you have to take into account a whole variety of other stakeholders. So you have to take into account the community in which the organization is operating, the employees, the environment, the suppliers. There's a whole gamut of groups involved with the organization upon which its success to some degree depends, and they need taking account of, perhaps so that the organization can succeed over time, perhaps on the basis of a moral or ethical requirement. So that's stakeholder theory. And soft systems approach, I think, is different in that it's an approach to solving ill-structured problems, where the issue is as much about what we should be doing as how we should be doing it. So Checkland started as a soft systems methodology, if I take that example. He went into a systems engineering department where they were interested in transferring systems engineering to the management domain, softer, more complex domain, but they adhered to the notion you could decide upon a goal and find the best way of reaching that goal. And Checkland thought that just didn't work. There were too many different perspectives on the nature of what the goal should be, or what the organization might be achieving, or the purposes it might serve, or how you might get there. And an interesting way of exploring that is to look at the different, he would call them problem owners, but you can call them stakeholders if you like, and their different perspectives on the problem. So there you might have different ways of dealing with the issues from the point of view of the community, the organization's managers, the shareholders, the suppliers, and the environment, and so on. And the critique of Checkland from the emancipatory systems perspective is he doesn't require you actually to take into account all the different stakeholders. So Werner Ulrich argued that you actually have to take account of stakeholders who, though they may be affected by a systems design, are not actually involved in that design. So they're affected but not involved, and they need to be given a voice as well. So that's closer to a broader form of stakeholder theory than you get in soft systems methodology. So there are relationships between these three things: stakeholder theory, checks and soft systems methodology, critical systems heuristics that requires you to take into account the views of all the different stakeholders affected as well as involved, but they're not the same.
Thank you, Mike. Chris Dalton has an interesting question here, I think alluding to early discussion on success and intentionality. Is the success story ever possible in system thinking? Aren't we always going to mess things up unintentionally in the end?
No, I don't. I would not be that pessimistic. No. The whole point of this is the reason for critical system thinking was very much in the early days. The notion of critical system thinking came from the Frankfurt School, so it was aligned itself to improving society. If you look at pragmatism and the work of James Pearson and Dewey, they have no different notion, of course, the Frankfurt School, but well, nevertheless, it's an engagement, and science and intervention is there to bring about general improvement. So that's the enterprise we're all engaged in. Now, I'm engaged in critical systems thinkers, and I think most people would identify with whether they adopt a Frankfurt School or pragmatist approach. So we're trying to take account of all that knowledge, and I think you can see progress. Of course, there's less poverty in the world than there was. Let's hope we don't have the kind of world wars and genocide. I know we still have all these things. There's one hell of a lot of work to be done. But I'm looking towards finding out ways of looking at the world which have been useful to the human species over time. This is the experiential gestalt. And my God, how useful the mechanistic perspective has been to us, you know, how extremely, incredibly successful we've been through translating that into natural science and technology. And I'm looking to give space to other experiential gestalts which we found useful over time. Give them an airing, give them airtime and space to flourish, and so we can view the world through those alternatives. And I think that will help us to counter, because of course pushing the mechanistic perspective too far also leads to the kind of issues that we face as crucial to us today, you know, in pollution, for example, being one of them, climate change being one of them. It's time to bring these other perspectives to the fore now and in a more balanced way, so that the improvement is across the piece, even though, you know, you improve one thing and you knock another thing back. So you're looking through these variety of perspectives, using the variety of systems methodologies arranged with those perspectives for some form of general improvement. And whether it's my generally optimistic nature or whether there are things there to give me encouragement, a bit of both, I think. I think that there are ways of going forward better than we have in the past, and let's hope COVID-19 is a bit of a catalyst to doing things differently.
Thanks, Mike. I'm aware that we're drawing to a close, so we probably have another time for one or two more questions. Wendy Chang is asking an interesting question which ties to the kind of research agendas. Does a 3P in strategy as practice embody system thinking? Presumably 3P refers to Whittington's practice, and practitioners.
I wouldn't want to have a stab at that, Ibrat, because I'm not familiar enough with that aspect of the literature.
Okay.
The questioner can relate what I've said to their knowledge of that literature.
Okay, no, that's fine. Jennifer's question, I lost it. Any suggestions for an ideal lens to monitor or measure and mitigate risk in organizations?
Yeah, undoubtedly. I think, again, I think all the different lenses are important for that. Yeah, I mean, of course, looking at alternative scenarios through the lens of soft systems perspectives, looking at who you might be disadvantaging and therefore why things might go wrong for your organization. Looking at how the environment might change and whether organizations are sufficiently robust and resilient to stand change in the environment. I think this does change the nature of risk and the way we perceive risk. I think the next big step and I hope it be embraced by complexity theorists as well, is to make the kind of work we've been doing much more relevant to decision makers. I mean, some people are having some success in this, but there's still a long way to go. We need to engage with the debates that are going on, you know, how to build better post-COVID, for example, about that stakeholder v shareholder debate, about whether capitalism can be restructured or we're looking to some sort of post-capitalist future. I think all these, your ways of looking at these things can be informed by systems and complexity theory, and those are debates that we have as academics or informed reflective practitioners have to engage much more with.
So I think
perhaps, yeah, Andrey.
I was going to say, I think we're pretty much out of time. There are lots of questions in the chat room, Mike, but we will not lose them. We'll share them with you after the webinar. But perhaps, if you allow me, unless Ibrat, you wanted to ask something else. If you allow me, Ibrat and I have sort of 3 questions with which we would like to, end these webinars. And one of these questions for you is, and it might be a difficult one, but is there any book, any piece of information, any article that you would regard as a formative reading for you in this space that kind of shaped your thinking more than anything, more than other things?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned, well, I was, you see, I'd done some systems thinking before I went to Lancaster. So I was familiar with particularly Marxian approaches, which are very systemic, and perhaps why I'm interested so much in Bogdanov at the moment, with his work is being found again and used again in all kinds of areas, thought about again. And of course, then Cheklin's work was very important to me. Just absolutely transformed my way of thinking. And coming back to a question that was asked earlier, that I didn't really understand that approach until I went out into the world and used it. These are not intellectual exercises. You really have to be confronted by complex problems before you start to see the use of these ideas. And then the work of Stafford Beer. I became, luckily for me, a friend of Russ Aikoff, and his work inspired me. Within the systems tradition of work, I would turn to Cheklin, Aikoff, and Stafford Beer.
All right. And maybe flipping this question around, what are you reading now? What's on your desk now?
Oh, well, interestingly, I've got to have a debate. Well, I haven't got to have a debate. I'm very pleased to be debating in a couple of months with Carlos Rovelli, who's a physicist known for quantum gravity. And Carlos Rovelli has discovered, I'd actually read Rovelli's 7 Theories of Physics or something, and there's another one on time. And I included stuff about that in my book, and saw it as very systemic way of thinking about quantum gravity, about physics. Rovelli's gone the other way, and he's discovered Bogdanov's work, and he sees it along with that of Heisenberg as one of the main stimuluses now to his theories of quantum gravity. And his new book Helgoland, which is coming out. Well, I think it's just about out it's out this month. I got an advanced copy of it for it, and there's a chapter on Bogdanov's work and the influence of it on his thinking. So there's an opportunity here again to look at systems thinking in the physical sciences and systems thinking in my area of knowledge is in the management and social sciences, and seeing what the links are there. So I've got to read Ravelli's stuff in order to debate with him about those sorts of issues. It should be online. It's in Hull sometime in early June, but I'm sure there'll be publicity about that.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't think it's out in English yet. I think it's out in Italian, but...
No, it's out in English this month.
Okay. And perhaps the final question maybe, who do you think is doing interesting work in this space? Maybe besides Carlo Ravelli.
Well, I'm going to point to the work, obviously, at Hull, which is still ongoing. We still have our Centre for Systems Studies there. But I will go back to the point made by Chris Moles from Hertfordshire in the Institute of Physics thing, is that, you know, there's a huge opportunity for us in influencing decision makers who are looking for alternatives. Robert Chia last week was talking about the need, you know, people are stuck still in the substance metaphysics, the mechanistic paradigm, and we need to get people to the process paradigm. I was talking to the senior staff development people in the cabinet office, and they're exactly the same. How do they shift people from one way of thinking, a mechanistic way of thinking, the idea that problems are there to be solved, to an alternative, more process-oriented way of thinking, where problems appear and reappear, and you manage and navigate your way through these forms of complexity. We've got a huge opportunity here where everybody, the UN, UNESCO, WHO, private industry, public sector, charitable organizations, saying we need better understanding of systems and complexity, but we don't do ourselves any favors by arguing among ourselves. And I think the most important work would be to achieve, you know, debates of this, I hope this nature, but with more people coming back. I'm sure there's some impolite questions on the chat as well. To having proper debates, so that we do, and Robert Chia was talking about process-orientated management and organization theories. We've got a lot in common in terms of pushing beyond the mainstream, and there's much room for us talking each other and finding commonalities, rather than arguing among ourselves about whether systems is better than complexity or complexity better than systems or organization theory and so on, so forth. So the better work is still to come. Fantastic.
Thank you very much, Mike. Thank you for such an engaging and informative webinar. Ibrat, any last words here?
No, thank you, Mike. And just wanted to check with you, Andrey, if you want to announce about our next speaker and the event.
I'm slightly hesitant to do this because it's not fully confirmed yet, but our next speaker will be Professor Mary Ulbein from Texas Christian University, and she will talk about complexity leadership. Provisionally, it will be on the 14th of April at the same time. But thank you again, Mike. Thank you, Ibrat, and thank you everyone also for being here.
Okay, great stuff. Thank you. Enjoyed it.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much.